Thank you so much for coming to Rabbi Debbie's and my session on end of life and funerals. At the beginning of the novella, A Whole Life by the Austrian novelist Robert Seethaler, the protagonist, whose name is Andreas Egger, is carrying a dying goat herd from his hut high up in the mountains down to the village below. Egger stumbles and falls with the goat herd on his back. The dying man on Egger's back asks him, "Where do you want to lie, Andreas Egger? What earth do you want to be buried in?" "I don't know," replies Egger. He had never considered the question. There was no point in wasting any time or thought on such things. The earth is the earth. It makes no difference where you lie. Maybe it makes no difference, the way nothing makes any difference in the end, says the goatherd in a whisper. But there will be cold, a cold that gnaws the bones and the soul. The passage in which death is referred to as the cold lady who walks on the mountain and steals through the valley reminded me of a conversation I had with a patient in the North London hospice many years ago. Visiting individuals who are facing the end of their days is a task that requires the utmost sensitivity and a prayerful approach, meaning that even if someone doesn't wish to pray with you, entering someone's room requires the kind of orientation and preparation in the visitor that one would make when entering a moment of prayer, stillness, willingness to listen, to be open, to
Hello,
hold
everyone.
whatever takes place in that room by someone's bed. I no longer remember the context of this conversation, but after a little time of sitting in the room with a woman who was not elderly, we both turned to speaking about what we were scared of when it comes to dying. She was scared of maggots eating away at her body after burial. I was scared of the icy, gnawing cold, of being underground. Of course, there's an absurdity about this conversation, yet the fear and dread expressed by both of us carried an unfeigned truth about our last days and what happens afterwards. We laughed at the incongruity of where our imaginations had taken us, and it was a moment that has stayed with me for many years since that visit. Rabbi Debbie and I are going to have a conversation about how we, as progressive Jewish rabbis, address questions about the end of life, about funerals, shivas, shloshim, yahrzeits, and other related matters. We face these things on a weekly, often a daily basis.
I think this is one of those really important topics that we quite often don't like to talk about because somehow death is something we shouldn't mention. But of course, Alex and I, it's something we do and talk about all the time. And I think perhaps the most progressive part of what we do and how we would, or certainly how I would approach families who are approaching that end of life moment is to really hear where they are and what their fears are, what their journey looks like for them. I think a lot of people start to have questions towards this point. Some in the family will start thinking about the after point and want to start getting things in order. Sometimes the person who's dying will have lots of things that they want to make sure are said if they're able to. I think quite often we're actually, if we have the privilege of being invited in, quite often we're not. Quite often we are the point of contact after the death has happened. But when we do have the privilege of going in, personally, I've found it really humbling to hold families through these kind of last hours where I think the most meaningful thing I've been able to bring into the room is song, and being able to pray in some meaningful way with people who are often quite surprised that they sort of don't know what they want from us, but what we can bring is prayer. And that prayer isn't always for healing. Sometimes the prayer is for a gentle journey. Um, and I'm also conscious, we've also walked these journeys for ourselves, and we have to know that our journey that we've been on isn't always about the other journey that someone else is going on this time, and to be open to the possibilities of what each journey is going to look like. I'm reminded of when Alex was in fact my rabbi, and my parents' rabbi, and my father was in those last weeks. And Alex very kindly came to visit. And he couldn't really communicate much anymore, but definitely was able to let Alex know that he didn't want this prayer stuff. Because I think we were not sure, but I think for him, and I've certainly experienced this with others, there was a sense of this is the angel of death coming. And we don't want the angel of death coming and bringing things quicker. So I think being able to sit with people where they are, sometimes in prayer and sometimes not, sometimes just holding a hand and being present, and acknowledging for people that what they're experiencing is real, is a part of that journey. I don't know
Debbie,
this, Alex, but I'm just curious. I've had a few times in the last year people talking about seeing loved ones who have already passed in the room with us as we approach the point. I wonder if that's an experience you've had, and what you do with that.
Definitely, I have had that experience of, and I think it's an expression often that the end is near, and that they feel very close to a parent or parents who've died before them. Often they're standing in the doorway. But I wanted just to ask you another little question, if I could put one in. Is there a particular liturgy that you use with people who are towards the end of life? Is there something in the Reform prayer book, or is it something that you pluck out of your own head?
I do tend to take the little traveling prayer book with me, and there are deathbed prayers in there. I've once written my own sort of series of deathbed prayers for a family who asked me to come and be with them while their son's life support machines were turned off. And I've been in that position a few times, but this one in particular, I'd been on the journey with the family for quite a few weeks. And I think in that instance, he was essentially already brain dead, and the prayers weren't really for him, they were for the family. Whereas in other instances, it's really about accompanying the person who is very much aware. So in that instance, I sort of adapted some prayers. I think my go-to usually includes a Sinai, because I think it's one of those liturgical pieces that people really connect to because it's so familiar. It's a cry to the world for help. Where shall I lift my eyes? And my hope in bringing a Sinai is that when they lift their eyes up, they see that there is help around them, that we are there together. And of course, it will then also be heard, usually if I'm doing the funeral, we'll hear it again. And there's a sort of comfort in that continuity. Sometimes we might try and say the Shema. And sometimes I've offered healing prayers, even though it's not about healing the body at that point, but healing the spirit and having a gentle journey. What do you tend to use, Alex, from the Liberal?
Well, I think there is a very beautiful prayer in the Reform prayer book, which goes something like, if it is your will, O God, to take this person from this life across the threshold to the world beyond, then let him go gently, or her go gently. If it is not, then heal. And I think that's both a kind of acknowledgement of, the reality of somebody is going to die, but also not to lose hope as well, if it is God's will that that person be healed. But can I move on to funerals? Because Orthodoxy will often bury on the very same day, giving families very little time for preparation or gathering friends or family around. We offer burial, we offer cremation, we offer woodland burial. Do you think that questions around how we dispose of the body in an environmentally friendly way will lead to other forms of disposal, such as aquamation or resomation, using water, heat, and an alkaline solution to break down the body in a faster, more controlled way? Do you think environmental ways of saying farewell to our loved ones is the way forward for progressive Jews?
Yeah, and I already hear that sense from a lot of people of that's part of their thinking process when they're making their own plans. And that feeling that taking up a piece of real estate for, an indefinite amount of time doesn't make sense anymore, although that is still the way I think that majority do tend to go. I think one of the anxieties that I quite often hear from families is this hangover sense of we must do this as fast as possible. And there's often a relief when they realize that they could take a day or two or even three, and sometimes longer if coroners are involved, if family need to travel from Australia. I find people are very apologetic, saying, "Oh, we should really wait for, my sister to arrive." Of course, we're going to wait for your sister to arrive. Although, by the same token, we do now have live streams and Zooms and all sorts of ways that we can allow accessibility to our funerals, which I often joke we didn't learn about this in rabbinical school, but we learned very fast during COVID. And actually, of course, it's something we should have been doing much better for much longer. And I think it's a good thing that we do. But giving people a bit of time to think and get the funeral, certainly the words. Again, I don't know if this has been your experience, but I found over the last sort of 16 years of being in the rabbinate, I seem to write a lot fewer eulogies now than I did 10 years ago. And I think it's wonderful. I think it's really beautiful when families are able to eulogize. And having that little bit of extra time allows them that space to do it. And it's a very cathartic process, writing those memories down and framing how you want this person to be remembered by others. But yes, I think that environmental question has to almost be answered by the deceased beforehand. I think it's a very difficult decision for families to make after. And that's one of the reasons I think these death conversations are so important, even though we don't like having them when we're alive. Letting your family know what your wishes are, whether it's about organ donation or, which we can come back to later, or how you want to be buried. There are lots of options now. As progressive clergy, we're really happy to be part of them. I think a decade ago, I think cremation was seen as the environmental choice. I'm not sure I see it that way today. But I mean, the woodland burial that we have up at Cheshunt is gorgeous. I've also done woodland burials in sort of general municipal cemeteries. And I do think there's something deeply Jewish about having that reconnection to the land and to returning the body to the earth.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I also think Jewishly, there's something really poignant and powerful about the need for a place marker. Halachically, a place marker of where someone lies is really important, and we don't have to follow that. But I think for a lot of people, having a place to go is really important. So at the woodland burial, for example, they have very small headstones surrounded by wildflowers and planting, whereas, of course, a traditional cemetery would have much bigger headstones and body stones. And I think that's one of the things that will shift with this. But I know, for example, one of the things that we do during Elul up at Cheshunt is a memorial service for relatives, and particularly for people who've lost stillborn babies or had miscarriages. There's a place there to remember those losses too, and to have a place where stones are put, even if there may be remains and there may not be. So Kana has asked what a woodland burial is in the chat, so I'm going to just catch that really quickly. And Ilana, no, you don't have to be cremated for a woodland burial. Some ashes can be buried in a regular cemetery. They can be buried at the crematoria. There are columbariums, which are sort of stacked boxes that ashes go into. Some people add ashes to other graves that are in the family. For example, we were talking before everyone joined us about Amy Winehouse. Her ashes are interred with her grandmother at Edgwarebury. Woodland burial is essentially burying in an area that we've set aside with mixes of planting, trees, wildflowers. There are actually at Cheshunt two elements of the woodland burial. There's a sort of lawn area that does have full size headstones, but not body stones. And then there's a more free flowing wild planting area where bodies are laid to rest. The first funeral I went to, there was actually for Rabbi Lionel Blue, and he was one of the very first to have this woodland burial. In municipal woodland burials, I tend to find that the coffins are wicker, but at Cheshunt it's still using the typical plain pine boxes. And the idea is that we will decompose and feed the plants, but still have a place for people to come and visit. I think it's a really lovely thing.
If we could just add that liberal Judaism has a designated area in woodland, in a woodland burial place in Beaconsfield, and that is a wood. So you're buried. You can be buried under a tree. I think the markers are usually made out of wood, but there's plants and buddleias that attract butterflies that are planted on top of the actual grave. So it is, when you go there, it's a real wood. Debbie, can I ask you something very different now? Because the assisted dying bill is very topical, and whether as progressive rabbis we agree with it or not, and I imagine and know there's a diversity of opinions about whether assisted dying should happen in this country. What do you think might be required of us as rabbis when we might be faced with somebody, if the bill goes through, somebody who wants to take their own life or have assisted dying, those who choose assisted death? What do you think? Can you imagine what might be required of us as rabbis?
I mean, I think with anything that is controversial in this way, for me as a rabbi, the key role, as I see it for myself, is actually I want to be with people wherever they are. I want them to feel that I can be of service and support, whether that's about having an assisted death, or whether it's about having as much palliative care and hospice care and staying with family for as long as possible. That there are all sorts of ways this can play out, and I think we need to value people's choices as progressive Jews. I don't want to get sort of sucked into the debate.
No, but we have a pastoral responstrability towards all our members.
I can't make that decision for someone else. Obviously, I do have my own strongly held opinions, but ultimately, my own opinions are irrelevant when someone else is making the choice of their life. If this is legal and that's what someone chooses, whatever my approach is, I want to be able to support them in making their journey as peaceful and potentially spiritual as possible.
Yeah. Simon in the chat has said that you understand, Simon, that the progressive movement has taken a neutral position on assisted dying. Actually, that they haven't taken a single position, because I think there are multiple different views about assisted dying. I think I'm right in saying, and Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Romaine edited a book of essays on assisted dying some time ago, and that the essays from different rabbis reflect those different pro, against, sitting on the fence.
I suppose it is a neutral position, right? We're going to present both sides and say make your own sort of place in
Yeah,
it.
yeah, I guess.
Yes.
And
I do think that's about as progressive as we can get.
Yeah.
There is a multivocality on it.
Yeah.
For me, I want to value the people I'm with and the choices they make. And make their journeys. Because where would you see yourself sort of supporting through that?
Pastorally, having a duty of care to my members, and exactly as you say, supporting them on each step of the way, and ensuring that the steps they take are meaningful to them, and if they want it within a sort of spiritual religious context, prayer, if it would help, writing a special prayer for them perhaps. But I think it depends on the individual. But I definitely would say we have a pastoral duty towards our members, whatever we see, whatever we think.
And every death is different. But I find myself feeling that if assisted death becomes part of the story, the pastoral care for relatives will be quite specific and niche. And will need us to really think about that. I think that there is a very specific kind of care. There may be relatives who disagree with the decision, or relatives who might feel maybe they've encouraged someone to feel a particular way about a position. I just think the pastoral care may feel different.
Maybe it's about not being judgmental, in the aftermath of it, or even before, which leads me to my last question to you for the minute, which is many non-Jews remark on the way Judaism marks the different stages of mourning, Shiva Shloshim, the 30-day period, Yahtzites. How do you approach some of the rituals associated with mourning, including observances that are perhaps less common among progressive Jews, such as Kriya? Would you say there's a particular progressive way in which you approach these stages of mourning and helping your congregants?
I know I'm a person who loves ritual and really sees the benefit in embracing ritual. But I'm also a progressive Jew who wants people to make informed choices about what's right for them and about their needs. So what I try to do is present the options when we start planning. So Kriya, for example, is the ripping of one's clothes, putting on the outside that inner sense of what is broken. And for some people, it doesn't make any sense and it's very alienating. And for others, it's a really sort of powerful outward moment of what's going on. I know in America now they've started pinning ribbons onto people and ripping ribbons instead. I tried it once and the ribbons are really hard to rip, so I don't recommend that, having given it a go. So essentially, I would walk people through what their options are. There's Kriya, there's, do you feel able to say Kaddish, or would you like people to support you in saying Kaddish? I recently met someone who had deliberately avoided ever saying Kaddish because they felt that while their parents were both still alive, that wasn't something they should say. Whereas I grew up in a community where everybody always said Kaddish because there was always someone who didn't have Kaddish from the Shoah being said for them. And there is a very interesting kind of journey, I think, that our movements are on at the moment around what it is to meaningfully say Kaddish. I know there's a sense in lots of places that we actually do need to identify our mourners better in order to be able to support them, which in a more Orthodox tradition where people stand up and say the Kaddish and everyone else responds, it's much more obvious. So people have come up with lots of different ways of doing that. So I know Rabbi Paul Friedman at Radlett started a tradition of inviting anyone who was marking a yahrzeit to come up and put a stone into a bowl, which I thought was quite a beautiful way of doing that. At Finchley Reform, I think people sit down and stand up as their relatives' names are read out, so people can acknowledge who's there. I think here at Edgware, we have more people who are sort of identifying with that traditional practice of wanting to respond to the mourner's Kaddish. But we also have a lot of people who just don't feel they have the skills to say it and would want support when it was their turn. But I do, so, we give people a choice of how many days shiva would you like to sit? Or would you like to sit shiva at all? Because not everybody does. It's not something everyone feels they can do. And I think shiva is one of those things that really comes into its own when you have been part of a community. When you're not really part of a community and you don't have that support system around you, it's very difficult to navigate. But I do think psychologically, Judaism knew what it was doing when it worked out these different periods, the Shiva, the Shloshim, the 30 days, and then having an annual time on yard sites. And I don't know what the LJ tradition is around Yizkor, but having, not only on Yom Kippur, but sometimes on major festivals, having an opportunity to just touch base with that grief again and bring it out into the open, I think is a really important part of helping us live better, because it allows us to shine the light on the grief from time to time and then carry on because we've been able to do that.
I think that's a really important thing that you've mentioned about Yizkor, if I can just add, because it's quite a late custom. It's medieval. It doesn't go back that far in as far as sort of Jewish history is concerned. And the
Sephardim don't do it at all, in fact.
Well, they do Hashkabah, don't they? But actually, on October the 7th, when it was Simchat Torah, I started the custom of reading Yizkor on Simchat Torah some years ago when I got to the LGS. They didn't used to do it. They didn't used to do it on last day Pesach either. And I think it was incredibly powerful, and it remains powerful on the anniversary of Simchat Torah and October the 7th, to be able to turn from the joyousness of dancing with the Sifrei Torah to saying Yizkor. So it was very powerful, I think, and very, very moving.
I read an amazing book last year by Rabbi Sharon Brous called The Amen Effect. And I don't know if anyone else has had a read of that one, but one of the images that she paints is of the Kaddish as a prayer that shows the community showing up for each other. The call and response nature of it being indicative of the community saying to the mourner, we see you, we're here for you. And in a lot of progressive synagogues, we kind of moved away from that format for many years, as we were saying before, with the remembering of Holocaust victims, although less so, I think, at shivers and funerals. I wondered if you could talk a bit, as you're such a wonderful liturgist, about the way that the funeral service and liturgy more broadly support our mourners.
So one of the most striking elements for me of the funeral service, the funeral liturgy, and its use of psalms and psalm verses, is the way it places the individual as part of the cycle of nature, of life and death. Our days are as grass, we blossom as the flower of the field. The wind passes over and it is gone, and it stays, its place knows it no more. And so this idea of transience in nature is transferred to human beings, to our lives. And it always seems to me that the funeral service reinforces the humility we are required to cultivate in the presence of God. We're not the center of the universe. And I've been quite struck at humanist funerals where you don't have that kind of context, the human being as part of the natural cycle of life, or the transience of nature. And I think that the notion is comforting to mourners. But of course, I think there's also a discomforting part, which is the central part of the liturgy, the Tziduk Hadin, the affirmation of God's righteousness at the very moment of our deepest sorrow, and at the moment when we feel life may be unjust towards us. So I find it very, very difficult to recite those verses, which in the liberal funeral liturgy begin, "You are righteous, O God, our rock, and all your ways are just. Who can question your work? Who can understand the mysteries of your ways?" Particularly when I'm burying a young person or a child, somebody who's on the cusp of adulthood. So I could choose to omit that part when burying the young, but it's a passage that also speaks of God's infinite compassion. And one wants a family, friends to be held at that moment, to know that there's a presence greater than them who remains constant, faithful, who weeps with them, if you like. And I think that verse, "For you are a God of infinite compassion," is saying to us, those who accompany the mourners at difficult times, this is what we're required to do, to be present for others, not to make things better, not to offer platitudes, but to simply pour out our love and our compassion to those whose suffering is so acute. So I think that the liturgy does those two things. It places us within the context of the natural cycle of life and death, of birth and death. And it's also there to help us address the most painful parts of loss.
The liturgy is there to support us. It can't always help us make decisions and understand what choices are around us. Obviously there are decisions to be made around the body, and if people want to ask about organ donation and things like that, we can talk about that more at the end. And obviously Progressive Judaism has shifted away from the Orthodox, or perceived actually Orthodox tradition of it's all forbidden. And there are actually Orthodox ways of doing it now too. But one of the roots of that thought process has come from a sort of medieval idea that the whole body needs to be there for resurrection, just slightly ridiculous when you think about decomposition. But that, of course, is only one idea of what's going to happen to us in Olam Haba, in the world to come. How do you understand and explain when asked, what is the world to come? What can we expect? Do you have any certain answers for us, Alex?
So funnily enough, I had this very precise conversation last night with a class that I was teaching at the LJS, and we were studying the weekday liturgy and focused especially on the second paragraph, the second blessing of the Amidah, the Gevurot, Ata Gibor Le'olam Adonai, Mechaye Meitim Ata. You are mighty, Eternal One. Mechaye Meitim, of course, which is a blessing originally about resurrection. You quicken the dead, is what traditional translations used to say in English. You give life to the dead. And we talked a bit earlier about being with individuals close to death who see their parents or other close relatives who've predeceased them at the door, perhaps beckoning to them. I don't know that this explains or proves the world to come, but I do think it expresses our hope, our longing to be with those we love and have lost. And I think it's also an indication of how close people are to death. We simply don't know if there's an Olam Haba, a world to come. I don't think we can pronounce or say what there is. But I think there are some things that we could say and offer mourners when we speak to them in our eulogies. And they're around how we keep alive memories of the person who's died. How do we continue our lives with that individual as part of our lives, even if not as a physical part of that life? So is there a way to live with the emptiness and a profound sense of loss of a loved one, but with a sense of their presence, something that allows us to commit to living in this cycle of darkness and light, of death and life. So how do we know? We can't know. I have members who joke about it and say there are some people they wouldn't want to meet in the Olam Haba, and they prefer not to be in the same room as them. I have members who just are longing to be reunited with loved ones, particularly where they've lost children. And, painful waiting with patience. One family said to me, one woman who'd lost her daughter said, "Don't wish me comfort, wish me patience," because that's what she needed in order to be reunited with her daughter. And others, obviously, just kind of closed to the idea of the world to come. But it's a very powerful idea. It's not really a biblical idea. It's an idea that grew probably during the Greek period and into the rabbinic period.
Often people really would like us to know exactly what to expect and to have a firm answer. And I often feel like I'm a bit of a disappointment because I don't have a firm answer. I have hope, but actually I think part of that hope is born out of the fact that within Judaism, because it's an idea that's changed and grown over time, there are maybe a dozen, if not more, ideas of what Olam Haba looks like or is, which actually I think is in and of itself a really important lesson, which is we're not meant to know. We're meant to focus on living this life as well as possible, which the grieving rituals we already talked about, I think really help us to do in a practical way. We give ourselves time to feel the pain, having heard the soil on the coffin or watched the coffin depart into the next room at a cremation. We allow ourselves time and space in Shiva to grieve so that we can then get up and live better. And I think that the views of the afterlife are a big part of that, of saying, we're not meant to know, we hope, but we're not meant to know for sure. We're meant to really stay here in the present.
But I'm quite strongly influenced by the Maimonidean idea of the Olam Haba, that the soul, whatever that means, will bask in the light of God's presence. So we can't know, it's beyond our understanding. But I like this idea of a very spiritualized idea that there's a soul and that the soul in some way goes on living after death or returns to God who gave it. Even if that's just a literary idea, I'm taken with it, that our bodies return to the earth and that our soul returns to God who gave it. I can see some questions in the chat about will there be a progressive funeral, Shiva and stone setting prayer book?
I would imagine in decades to come, yes, I think initially nothing's going to massively shift immediately. But it seems generationally that will be inevitable, but it will take decades, I suspect. I don't know.
It's interesting, isn't it, as well, that there isn't really a fixed funeral service, so that, you've got a collection of psalms and readings, this center bit, the Tziduk Hadin, the Kaddish, obviously, the El Malei Rachamim. But around
clergy teams, I imagine that everyone in your team, just as everyone in my team, does everything slightly differently, their own little way, picks what works. And
I think that's right.
And I would like to put in a plea that the Pilgrim Festivals Mahsur in the Reform movement needs working on before anything else, please. Don't get onto funeral books yet. They're fine. In terms of assisted dying, the movements are saying our rabbis have diverse opinions, and we're not here to. Some people are actively campaigning for, some people might be actively campaigning against, and ultimately, Alex and I think, are interested in how do we walk the journey pastorally that people choose, whatever our personal approach might be.
This isn't a question so much as something that I discovered when my mother died a couple of years ago, which I think is worthy of spreading it further. I found out that there was an organization called hesped.org. And hesped.org it describes itself as an online treasury of eulogies which were delivered at Jewish funerals, in the homes of mourners, and at stone-setting ceremonies. And I have my eulogy for my mother is now up there, and from my other members of my family have followed suit and have been putting them up. And it's going back and reading them, months after the event, and at her stone setting was really powerful. I don't know how this site started, but it's a wonderful.
Yeah, it
was started by a member of A-List Reform,
Miriam Gravina. Yeah.
Yeah, I think to remember her mother, but I might be misremembering that. It's an amazing site, and sometimes so I also have shared. My grandfather's hesped is there. And I keep meaning to put more, but forgetting. And I often recommend it to families who are writing their own eulogies. And I think that's such a good catch, Leslie. It's such a wonderful way of preserving a moment. We don't write about these things very often. And I actually want to tie that in with what Kana has asked in the chat, which is how do you help those that are fearful of nearing their end? There are lots and lots of answers to that question. And part of it is hearing their fears, but another part of it actually is if you know someone is nearing the end, allowing family to share some of what might become ultimately a hesped, a eulogy, I think is very comforting. There are not many gifts in the process of dying when you know that that's what's happening. But actually being able to tell your loved one the things that they wouldn't otherwise hear because it only goes into a eulogy, I think can be very comforting, and to hear that they've made a difference and that they've had an impact.
I mean, the other thing I would want to say is the use of prayer and touch as well, although one has to be quite careful. I learnt when I was a chaplain at the hospice that if family's present, they don't want some stranger coming and holding their hand, their mother's hand or their father's hand. And also, if somebody's terribly weak, it's really important not to lay your hand on top of theirs, but to slip it underneath so that the weight of your hand isn't on top of theirs. But I think there are ways of reassuring not just the person who's dying, but the people around them, because their distress is also communicated to the person who's dying. There's a question about music at funerals, and there is, definitely there's an austerity when you're burying people. I think that there's very rarely music. Of course, at cremations, there's often music at the beginning, at the end. There's often music during the committal. And I do encourage that because cremations are very stark, particularly during committal when you see the coffin go, although a lot of people don't want to see the coffin go, and it's not my job to tell them the coffin should go, but for them to choose. But I did a stone setting recently, and the grieving widower, after 11 months, who spends every single day by his wife's grave, sitting on a bench which he has provided, mowing the lawn around his wife's grave, treating it with something to make it greener than the rest of the grass around in the cemetery. He wanted somebody to sing at that stone setting, and I wanted to give him a chance to find a way of processing his grief. Not that you ever come to the end of your grief or sorrow. I don't believe it's like that. You don't dust it down and then it's over at all. But, whatever, if it was seemly and tasteful and helped him in the end, then yes. I definitely would encourage music.
I have actually had families play from a sort of phone or a little Bluetooth speaker through the microphone in prayer halls, because it was so crucial that a piece of music was part of the service. And for me, if that's them needing that and processing that, I don't have a problem. I also, not everyone can do this themselves, but I will always sing in services. I'll always sing Esayanai, I'll always sing Amalei Rachamim, and I think having musical elements to the liturgy is very powerful. And it's fascinating when people feel they can join in and when they don't. But I think music can be something that really cracks us open emotionally, and so can be a very powerful tool to use.